do this?
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to start with a riddle.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. You ready?
Yes.
Mhm.
What do Nelson Mandela, a former MI6 spy, a Santa lookalike, David Beckham, an IRS agent, Vladimir Putin, and a parrot have in common?
Are we supposed to guess?
Sure.
Is it the scandal?
Yes. Ding, 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 ding. They are all part of today's story.
The Santa lookalike got me.
Get ready. Power and corruption are two sides of a wicked coin. Welcome to the podcast that tells stories of the world's largest and most salacious corruption scandals and explores the myriad ways corruption creeps into the hearts and minds of men and women, the consequences of corruption for perpetrators and victims, and the red flags that, had they been identified and addressed, might have changed the course of history. I'm Diana Shaw, and I'm joined today by my co-host,
Tatiana Sainati.
and our story developer.
Vab Patria.
We are all lawyers at the DC-based law firm Wiley Ryan. I'm a partner in the white-collar crimes practice. Tatiana is the co-head of our International Arbitration and Disputes group, and Vab is an associate in our Government Contracts group. So today, our corruption scandal is a big one, as we teased last time. Honestly, it's so big, it would probably take multiple episodes, so we're going to have to just focus on a specific angle, and maybe we'll come back to it in a future episode. We'll have to see. I guess I should start by apologizing to any of our listeners who are legitimate soccer fans, because I know I'm going to say something that is totally wrong at some point. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but I have done a lot of research for this because it is such a good story. It is fascinating, but to the extent that I get any of the sports part of it wrong, I apologize in advance. So today, we are going to talk about the story of what is arguably the world's largest sports scandal, and this involves the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, also known as FIFA. And we will be calling it FIFA because I know I just mangled the name. All right, so FIFA started in the early 1900s, and it really was just this loose organization to oversee amateur international soccer competitions. It was really that for like 75 years until this guy named João Havelange came into the picture. And João was a Brazilian former Olympic swimmer. And in 1974, he comes onto the scene and he challenges the FIFA president for the position. He campaigned on an anti-apartheid platform, and he promised to ban South Africa from participating in FIFA as long as apartheid continued. And he also promised a lot of direct development resources in African soccer federations. And as a result, he was able to get a lot of support. But it turns out it wasn't all altruism. So João's a really smart guy, and he realized that the countries that make up the Confederation of African Football had a significant number of votes in the election because each country has a vote. And so this is actually the first instance of potential corruption in today's story. There were rumors that João at the Frankfurt Congress that preceded the election may or may not have passed around a series of brown envelopes that may or may not have contained cash to help sweeten the deal when influencing the votes that resulted in his election. And I find this fascinating, Tatiana, because it seems to me that he probably could have succeeded without resorting to corruption, but he did it anyway. And it reminds me of Fat Leonard, the figure at the center of last month's scandal, who, as we discussed, provided a very good and important service, and he did it really well. And yet he still felt the need to resort to corruption. So what do you make of that?
It's a really fascinating question. I think it goes to a heart of both scandals and a lot of the scandals that I assume we'll be discussing in the future, because I think it's very rare that we find someone who's either purely good or purely evil, and where motives are not somewhat mixed. What's fascinating to me about this is that it sounds like Zhao had this fantastic idea. Like, we can use sport for a purpose. We can use it to advance social change. FIFA can actually be a platform to make the world a better place. And that's a powerful message. It's a beautiful message. And it's one that it sounds like would have resonated with a lot of the decision makers who were going to be voting at this Frankfurt Congress, even if he had not bribed them. And yet he's so nervous, or he's so worried that it's not going to be enough, that he goes ahead and decides to bribe people anyway. And so right from the very start, you have this paradox. You have something that's supposed to be for a social purpose, something that's supposed to advance what is good, and yet you're doing it from a place that's appealing not to people's better angels, but to their more puerile instincts.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as we'll see, I think in life, people are complex, right? Good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And honestly, it's just not always easy to tell which kind of person you're dealing with. All right, so this is really considered a critical inflection point in FIFA's history because Havelange was a businessman. His election really represented the introduction of capitalism into FIFA and the organization because he began to run FIFA like a business for the first time in its history. It was no longer a club amongst friends. And he had a shrewd understanding of the ways in which sport could be a path to political power, a little bit what you were talking about, Tatiana.
Well, and maybe he saw that there is within all of us, or collectively, a desire to achieve something positive, to affect positive change. And the cynic in me would say maybe he tapped into that instinct and saw the business potential in that instinct, saw a way to transform that into power and dollars for himself.
I think that's right. And I think he realized that he couldn't do it alone. So this is an important moment where he realizes that he needs to bring in a special skill set. So claiming to want to advance soccer development programs around the world. And remember, he made this promise on the campaign trail to bring development programming to African nations. He brings in a guy named Sepp Blatter. And this is really the name that is associated with FIFA and this corruption scandal. So Sepp is the first one to think about the commercial opportunities associated with soccer. He approached different companies and eventually found a very large corporation and got them to sponsor initially FIFA youth competitions and other development programs. And this is what started to bring the flow of money into FIFA. And it only grew from there. Sponsorships became increasingly lucrative to FIFA, bringing in millions and then hundreds of millions of dollars into the organization. And then from there came the marketing deals. And remember, this is 1974. It's right around the time that TV is becoming increasingly big, right? So it's just like the perfect moment for this to be happening. So now we've got, marketing deals for broadcasting the games, and this becomes huge business as well. So here we go, guys. Saddle up. Keep in mind now, okay, even though all of this money is flowing into FIFA, FIFA is supposed to be structured as a nonprofit, right? So they're raking in all this money, but it's supposed to all be flowing back into the sport. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear that's not happening. So the organization got very big very quickly, but as you can imagine, this is often the case, its internal controls didn't grow at the same pace as the money and the organization did. There were really no checks and balances, and no one knew exactly how much money was coming in or where it was going. And while no one was really supposed to be profiting off of their involvement, on the surface, you could see that clearly they were living very comfortable lives. They were driving the best cars. They're staying in the best hotels. They're living very luxurious lives. And over time, it becomes clear that part of the way they're able to do this is through corruption. And I'll give you just some of the examples that come up over time. So we have examples where FIFA senior officials and others would accept kickbacks and bribes for granting marketing rights, right? For World Cups and other important games. You would have confederation presidents who, I think this is just fascinating, they would refuse to play their star players in certain games unless they were given a bribe by the broadcaster. So, of course, the broadcaster knows that the best way to get viewership is if stars are going to be playing in the game that they're broadcasting. Well, the Confederation president would say, well, I'm going to bench my star player unless you bribe me. Okay,
Wow.
I'm going to make sure that star player plays. So there you go. And then, of course, where the World Cup gets played is big business. And so there are certain voting members, I think it's 24 or 22, that sit on the EXCO, the executive committee of FIFA. And they're the guys with the real juice. And over time, it became apparent that these are the guys who would solicit and accept bribes for votes on where the World Cup was played. And this was definitely supposed to be a no-no, but it's pretty clear that's what was happening. So first in small degrees and then growing, this is what's starting to become rife within the organization. Now, you remember the guy Sepp Blatter?
Mm-hmm.
In a fascinating twist, Sepp Blatter, who is, basically making this a commercial entity, manages to dethrone Havelange in 1988 by discovering written evidence of a kickback that Havelange was paid for marketing rights. So he finds this written evidence, and I don't know that this has been proven, but it's pretty well understood that this is what happened. He goes to Havelange and he says, I have proof.
Oh, man.
You're not going to run for president again. You're going to clear the way for me, and I'm not going to out you. And I'm going to take over from here. And that's the deal they struck.
So how did he step down? Like, was this known to the public or was this all hush-hush?
I think this was all hush at the time. So Havelange had been in place now, 74 to 88, 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
Math is not my strength, but I think that's right. And so he'd been in place for quite a while. He's an older gentleman. It didn't, I think, raise too many eyebrows. And Sepp had been his right-hand man for all this time. Havelange decides he's not going to run for re-election. Sepp goes forward. Havelange endorses him. And lo and behold, Sepp Blatter is now FIFA president. So then for the next 2 decades, it is the era of Sepp Blatter. And ironically, he dethrones Havelange by ferreting out corruption, and yet this is the period of probably the greatest corruption in FIFA's history.
Well, going back to mixed motives.
Right? Exactly. I mean, it is a very there's so many interesting twists and ironies in this story, and we're about to get to one right here. So one of the major players in the corruption scandal is this guy named Jack Warner. He's the head of CONCACAF, which is the confederation it's basically North America, Central America, and all of the Caribbean countries. And part of the reason why he's got so much juice is because there's so many Caribbean countries and every country gets a vote. So he has a lot of votes within his block. His sidekick is a guy named Chuck Blazer. He is our Santa lookalike. He's 6'3", 450 pounds, big, unruly white beard. At one point is rolling around on a motorized scooter with a parrot on his shoulder, just a really eccentric guy. Chuck Blazer went from coaching his kids' soccer team, AYSO on the weekends, somehow to the top tier of the FIFA pyramid. Not really clear how he managed to do it, but he used his position and power to bankroll this incredibly luxurious life. It's clear he took bribes for votes. He managed to get on EXCO, so he had a position where he could leverage it to solicit bribes. But he also made these sweetheart marketing deals. So every time a marketing deal came up, he basically wrote in a 10% cut for himself that went into his own pocket instead of circling back into FIFA and into programming. And he managed to evade detection in a couple of really clever ways. And we see this is kind of common with these sorts of characters. He created all of these shell companies, so he never got paid directly. Everything went to a shell company and then went to another shell company and another shell company. It was very hard to track. And he would also use structured payments. So a big payment would come in, it would be broken down into little payments. Those smaller payments would get shifted around, and eventually he's getting paid in small amounts that aren't going to trigger any kind of red flags with financial institutions, and so he's managing to stay under the radar. Now, while he may be staying under the radar in terms of how financial institutions track things, he is not staying under the radar in terms of his lifestyle. This man has 2 apartments in Trump Towers, one for himself and one for his cats.
Oh my God.
No.
Just pause for a moment
you can't
to
have
process
the parrot
that.
living with the cats.
Correct.
That would just be ridiculous.
Right? I mean, he's got a blog where he's posting pictures of himself on private jets with Nelson Mandela. I mean, this man is living large. He liked the best of everything. He never seemed to be able to get enough. And clearly, he considered himself untouchable, right? He's putting his life out there for all the world to see. And he really ends up being the linchpin in our story. He's the person who ended up bringing the FIFA scandal to light. Now, he isn't the person who put it on the FBI's radar, but he is the person who really broke the case wide open. And do you want to know how he got caught?
How?
Okay. Here's where our IRS agent comes into the picture. So picture a little IRS agent sitting in probably a windowless office in California who happens to be a huge soccer fan. He's toiling away at his desk doing whatever IRS agents do, and he gets a random news alert that says that the FBI may be investigating this guy named Chuck Blazer. And he knows that Chuck Blazer is associated with FIFA, whereas like most Americans don't really pay attention because soccer is not as huge in America as it is in other parts of the world. So he pays attention to this, and basically on a hunch, he runs Chuck Blazer's name through the system and pulls Blazer's tax records. What do you think he found?
Lots of anomalies. Nothing.
Bing! He found nothing. Chuck Blazer had not filed tax returns for 17 years.
17 years and they're just finding it now?
17 years. He had not declared a single dollar of income in 17 years. Interesting side note, apparently it's much easier to get caught for tax evasion by filing something for taxes and then they figure out that you've like underreported. It seems like if you don't file for taxes multiple years in a row, and this is not meant to be a roadmap for committing tax evasion, but the system, I guess, like starts to think you're dead and then, doesn't really do anything. Now, I hope they've actually fixed this.
Wow.
Yeah. So he managed to evade detection and had not declared a single dollar of income in 17 years.
Wow.
Meanwhile, he's like posting all this stuff on a blog. So the IRS agent knows he's got this guy dead to rights and basically goes to the FBI and begs to be part of their case and says, I can make this happen for you if you will let me be part of the case, lays it all out for them and convinces them that they should work with him. So they agree and they go to New York, confront Blazer outside of Trump Towers. He's walking to dinner one night with his girlfriend or wife. I can't remember. They sit down with him. They explain to him what they have on him. He like takes a beat and he's like, all right, I'll work with you. What do you want to know? And so he becomes like the best witness they could ever hope for because he's American. He speaks their language. He can translate soccer to them. He can translate the entire organization to them, all the players, all the schemes. He agrees to wear a wire.
Wow.
He records phone calls for them. He goes to dinners and they put a recording device in his keys and he'll just throw them down on the table and record entire dinners where they're discussing schemes. And apparently he sat for like hundreds of hours of info sessions with them, just explaining everything about what was happening. And ultimately, thanks to his help, they were able to develop what's called a RICO case. It's racketeering, and normally these are cases that the FBI brings against organized crime families, so Mafia. So they basically determined that FIFA was being run like an organized crime family, or at least that's the theory that the FBI and DOJ were putting forward. And after, advancing this over many years, they brought a 236-page criminal indictment. They have indicted about 4 dozen individuals and corporations. This has resulted in 31 guilty pleas and 4 trial convictions. Several corporations have entered into big settlements, and DOJ has recovered something like $500 million in restitution so far. DOJ was able to bring this case against all these players in all these different countries by establishing jurisdiction in the U.S. And the way they were able to do this is kind of interesting. As it turns out, all of this money, even though much of it was originating in other countries and its final destination was in other countries, it was all flowing through U.S. financial institutions at some point on its journey. And so that ended up being enough of a hook to create U.S. jurisdiction.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I assume New York would have some role in it because it's really hard not to touch the New York financial institutions if you've got any sort of international payments. So,
although interestingly, recently there's been a lot of talk about whether there was overreach in these cases. And so we'll see how that pans out.
Have other countries kind of jumped on the bandwagon? Because FIFA operates globally.
Yes. So some have. I know in Switzerland, they have moved. So the big hoo-ha when everything went overt was in 2015. There were arrests in Zurich of 7 EXCO members. Okay. And they were all arrested at a very shishi hotel and walked out with like 3,000 count bed sheets, covering them as they were put into cars. I mean, it was just so over the top. Warner is still on the run. He's managed to evade extradition. So Jack Warner, even though he's banned from FIFA, he's been indicted on 29 criminal charges, but he's still at large because he's managed to avoid extradition. Our Santa lookalike, Chuck Blazer, who interestingly, so talking about paradoxes, he initially went to the FBI before they confronted him and flipped him. He went to the FBI to complain about someone else taking kickbacks and was cast as a whistleblower.
That is bold.
Right? Yeah. Very interesting. And then everybody realized he was not a whistleblower. But even with all his help, he did plead guilty. But before he was sentenced, he passed away. So that's how things ended up for poor Chuck. And then for Sepp Blatter, right, the kingpin, he's denied from the mountaintops. He's denied that he knew about this, had anything to do with it, ever accepted a bribe. He claims that he did not ever endorse, condone, or know about this. And no criminal charges have ever been brought against him in the DOJ case. But he was banned from FIFA through 2027, so not a lifetime ban. He was fined $1 million by a FIFA ethics committee following a probe into some massive bonus payments. And do you want to know the circumstances around that?
Yes.
Love this. So basically, he paid himself a $27 million bonus from World Cup profits. Talk about no checks and balances. So basically, there were 3 guys at the top of the pyramid who could sign off on each other's salaries and bonus payments. And the 2 guys decided that he deserved a $27 million bonus, and then he decided that each of them deserved like $11 million bonuses or whatever it was, and they all just signed off on it. And that's not corruption. That's just they just deserved it because they worked really hard.
Well, and I can see how $1 million fine would really put you off of engaging in this type of behavior.
Exactly.
What is Putin's role in all of this? Because he was in our riddle.
Okay, so let's go to Putin. So in the 2010 timeframe, Russia is bidding for the 2018 World Cup, and they are bidding against the frontrunner, the UK. And the UK is the clear favorite. Their campaign is being led by David Beckham. He's a huge soccer star. He's also, Posh Spice's husband. UK has a storied history with soccer, so they are the clear favorite, whereas Russia has really no major soccer history to speak of, also no infrastructure to support a World Cup. They're deemed by the World Cup Committee as a quote-unquote high-risk country. And apparently, even during the presentation, their PowerPoint was super glitchy and didn't go very well. So really, it's not looking very good for Russia. But apparently, Putin, and listen, none of us can be in Putin's head, so I think this is all rumor, but apparently Putin, who at this time is, because of term limits, biding his time as prime minister of Russia, waiting to run for re-election as president in 2012, Putin realizes that this may be an opportunity for him to gain some popularity in advance of his campaign for the presidency in 2012. And also, the opportunity to host the World Cup in 2018 would be a real boon to his presidency. He throws the full weight of his support behind this, and he wants it to happen. And so rumor has it that despite having made a terrible presentation, there may have been some back channel deals, including the exchange of some very valuable pieces of art. And lo and behold, Russia is awarded the 2018 World Cup. And this introduces this interesting idea. I think Putin saw it, and we see this in other aspects of the FIFA story. And that is the introduction of a concept called sportswashing, this opportunity to use sport to enhance the image of a country and really potentially to wipe away some of the negativity around the country. And I know this is something you know a little something about, Tatiana. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about sportswashing?
Yeah, so sports washing, think of it as akin to greenwashing or whitewashing. Basically, what a country is doing or what an organization is doing if they're trying to sports wash is to shift attention and change focus, change their entire narrative from one that is maybe negative, one that is maybe centered on, for example, human rights violations, or in the case of, South Africa, civil rights violations, and say, wait a minute, don't think of human rights violations when you think of us. Think of sports. Think of us bringing communities of young people together and teams together and embarking in this great human adventure. And so it just becomes a way to distract negative attention and turn it into positive publicity.
Yeah, it's basically a way to cleanse a country's image, bathing it in all of the good associations that the world has with the sport. And we actually have other examples of it in the FIFA story. In 2022, the World Cup was awarded to Qatar, which was also another shocking situation, much like Russia, where Qatar did not have any of the infrastructure to support a World Cup. And oh, by the way, it's 120 degrees in Qatar when the World Cup would typically be played. And it has a history of human rights violations. And yet the whole idea around Qatar getting it is that, this is an opportunity for them to reshape the narrative around their country and to benefit from sports washing. But we have an earlier example as well. Early on in Havelange's tenure as president, the World Cup was awarded in 1978 to Argentina. And at the time, Argentina was ruled by a fascist dictator. And so what we have is the World Cup being broadcast around the world. We have a dictator standing in the box next to Havelange, right? And the image is one of unifying people around sports. All of the good, positive feelings that people associate with soccer and with the World Cup is washing over, right, this military dictatorship. So we see this as really kind of the modern beginning of sports washing.
Diana, so I know when this happened with Qatar, it was extremely controversial. I'm curious, back in 1974, was it controversial to host the World Cup in Argentina, or was this not really as big of a deal back then?
No, it actually was even then. I remember when I was doing the research that people were quite surprised. And in fact, Havelange was really put on his heels in having to defend himself and the decision. He kept saying, sports is not politics, sports is not politics. And yet, of course, we see that he sees sports as an avenue towards influencing politics and influencing, or at least being able to marshal some of the power that comes through political channels. And so it was sort of like he wanted to have it both ways, right? Talking out of both sides of his mouth. He wanted to be able to leverage the power of politics when it suited FIFA's needs. But then when the criticism sort of got shifted back on him, he wanted to say, well, sports isn't politics, it's separate. I think this is a good time for us to pivot to our red flag roundup, and we've got quite a few today.
There's so much, and I think one of the ones that I'm really grappling with, it's similar in a weird way to Fat Leonard. For me, it's tone at the top, of course, because we have EXCO, and then we've got the president, we've got all of these leaders who are really just engaging in rampant, open, and incredible, like it's just an incredibly overt willingness to participate in scandal and corruption and to take money under the guise of trying to do something good and promote soccer and promote like world togetherness. But where do you go? This was a similar thing in Fat Leonard. Who do you report that to? If you're reviewing the contracts with Chuck Blazer, you're like, well, that seems odd, but who do you report it to?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there was really nowhere to go. And in this case, I mean, unlike in the Fat Leonard case where there was just a total breakdown in tone at the top, in this case, we had a lip service issue here. So we had Sepp Blatter, who was claiming that he was taking corruption seriously, that there would be no corruption. And interestingly, so when Qatar won the 2022 World Cup and there was so much shock around it and swirling allegations of corruption, Sepp, tried to come forward and paint this picture that he was now going to be the face of the new FIFA, the no tolerance FIFA, the total reset FIFA. And he launched an ethics investigation. This is in the 2011 timeframe. He brought in a FIFA governance advisor to establish what they called a governance program that was worthy of this century. And he used this to try to shift the narrative, right? He put up this smoke screen. It was going to be the new era of FIFA transparency and zero tolerance. But even while this was going on, he's minimizing the seriousness of the situation, and he refused to call it an ethics crisis. So it's this mixed messaging, it's lip service over here, but to your point, there was no independent oversight. So he's building this up within FIFA. And in the end, all of the controls were still set up under and within FIFA and under his control. And really, it had no lasting impact. When they completed their work, they put forward a long list of recommendations, things about like how salaries should be set, right? There should be some checks and balances. You shouldn't be able to sign off on his salary when he's the one signing off on your salary. Really basic, governance and compliance stuff that we see all the time in not even the most sophisticated corporations. But because Blatter was the one in control and he was the one benefiting from it, he just basically told the group to wrap up. He cut their resources, and the folks who were involved in that realized that it was just a PR stunt. So I think, again, not to be a broken record, but it's critical to have more independence in your oversight. But I think there's something unique about the way that FIFA, its history and the way that it evolved, right, from a loose organization, really a club among friends. It grew very quickly. Tons of money flowing in. That, of course, introduces a ton of risk. And so what would typically happen is if it's a corporation or a company, you're going to be updating your risk profiles. You're going to be developing updated risk mitigation plans and compliance programs that will scale with your organization. But FIFA, because of what it was basically operating in a legal gray zone. It's essentially a members club. It's not a business. It's not a governmental organization. It's not even like a traditional NGO. And an interesting example that I saw is it's like basically creating a bowling club, right?
Yeah.
Like if I create a bowling club with you, Tatiana, and we run it like a dictatorship,
Who cares?
right? Does anybody care if we have like ethics guidelines or if we like misuse the dues? It's just nobody imagines that a bowling club is ever going to reach the scale of something like this. And so I think part of the problem is that there's no real framework for something like this, but it's so big that people feel like there should be rules, but it's basically self-governing.
It's interesting you say that. I know there's a great book, The Rise of the Sicilian Mafia, and what it discusses is, of course, the rise of the Sicilian Mafia, but the fact that in Sicily and southern Italy at the time when the Mafia came to power, there was no other infrastructure in place to provide any sort of rules, regulations, enforcement for society. There was just a power vacuum. And so if people got into a dispute with their neighbors over a contract for the sale of goods, they couldn't go to the police. They couldn't go to the courts. Those didn't exist. So the Mafia steps up. And I was thinking a little bit about it when you were talking about how FIFA came to life, because there is this massive opportunity for a sport that is growing in leaps and bounds and that has so much potential to have so much power and influence in the world. And it's not like the Olympics, which have been going on forever and have this like international committee and standards behind that committee and some sort of oversight outside the organization. It's really just FIFA. They're the only ones there, so they stepped into a vacuum and then they can do whatever they want in that vacuum.
Right. And it's been very closely held for a very long time by a very few people. And that's a dangerous recipe, as we see, because human nature being what it is, power and corruption
go together
like a wicked coin.
So that was 2 additional red flags: a lack of transparency, and when an organization grows too quickly without any external oversight, you have another real risk. And it's interesting because you have to wonder about the incentive for a compliance mechanism in a situation like this. Like, you really have to be forward thinking and realize there are going to be, again, real reputational harms. And we are going to risk losing this organization if we don't have some sort of compliance mechanism in place. But the short-term incentives to just get as much as you can while you're in power must be kind of hard to overcome.
I think that's right. I mean, that was something that I was struck with the whole time I was thinking about this and doing the research, is that there was just so little impetus for anybody in the machine to ever push for any kind of oversight or any kind of ethics guidelines or transparency, because everybody benefited. I mean, it's sort of the genius of the scheme. Everybody in the machine could benefit a little bit. And there was always the promise that if you could find yourself in a slightly higher elevation, that you could benefit more. And so, you know, really there was no incentive for anybody to call it out or to introduce anything more appropriate into the situation.
So that kind of brings up my next question. How, since all of this has come to light, how have things changed? Have there been any changes throughout the organization?
So, I mean, this is pretty recent, but Sepp Blatter stepped down. I cannot remember the name of the new person, but the new person, of course, has made all sorts of vows to do things better, to do things differently. Now, I mean, FIFA does have a code of ethics. Like, they have the rules, they have the policies and procedures, but as we know, there are maturity models for organizations. So having the policies and procedures is one thing. Having them consistently implemented is another thing. So hopefully they are moving on the maturity scale to consistent implementation, but time will tell. On an interesting final note, a lot of people have commented that really only the US could have brought this case and brought FIFA down, because every other country cares too much about soccer to have really taken this on. Like, only a country like the US that doesn't have this much history with the sport would have had, you know, less at stake, really. The UK couldn't have done it. South American countries wouldn't have done it. It's just so important. And so many commentaries note that it's just kind of fascinating that only the US would have been a country that could have taken this on.
That is amazing to me, because I almost have the exact opposite view. And maybe this just speaks to who I am, but I'm like, if you care so deeply about soccer, don't you want this well run? Like, look at what these people are doing to the sport you love. Look at how they are manipulating the players. Look at how they are manipulating like the funds that are being put in to help promote youth participation and promote development. And to me, it would be like almost the opposite incentive. I care so much about this, I'm not going to let you get away with it.
That's why we love you, Tatiana.
Well, to maybe tie it all together, it is fascinating to see how an organization that really came into its own on the promise of, we are going to combat apartheid, we are going to invest in development, we are going to hold governments accountable through sport, is now accused of allowing governments to kind of get away with some pretty egregious behavior and wash it away through sport and through the distraction of being able to host the World Cup. So what a kind of sad journey. And here's hoping that in the future it really does turn around.
Yeah, because it is such an important mission. And, you know, I guess to put a bit of a nicer twist on it, FIFA does so much, especially I think the youth programming around the world. And so it would be nice to know that all of the money that it is able to generate, because there's so much love for the sport,
Mm-hmm.
is really going back into that programming. And there's a need for it. And there is that unifying element of it that is special. And that's something that we see across sport. So it would be nice to see them clean up their act and be able to see all of those resources going to the programming that it's intended for. As I mentioned at the outset, the FIFA scandal actually has a lot more to it than we were able to cover today, so we'll be posting some additional information in the show notes and may come back and explore another angle of the scandal in future episodes. Until then, I want to thank our listeners for joining us for today's episode and invite you back next month when Tatiana will be sharing another salacious story of corruption. Tatiana, any teasers?
Well, once again, our listeners are just going to have to wait and see and join us. But we have another doozy for all of you. And I think you'll start to see some really interesting patterns emerging in these very different fields of corruption.
Can't wait. If you like this podcast, please let us know by liking us on whatever listening platform you use, and maybe even sharing us with your friends, family, or anyone you know who, like us, loves a good story about people behaving badly. In the meantime, be good, and we'll see you next month. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.